You know, when you think of animal sacrifice, a pretty dramatic picture probably comes to mind, right? It feels so ancient, so intense, and we kind of think we know the basics. But what if I told you about one ancient ritual that looks like a sacrifice, smells like a sacrifice, but completely shatters every rule in the book?
And that is the central mystery we're diving into today. We're looking at this ceremony with a red heifer that has all the right ingredients, an animal, an altar, fire, the whole deal. But in reality, it's something else entirely. Something, well, a lot stranger and way more practical than you'd ever guess.
Okay, so let's get into it. To understand why the red heifer is such a total weirdo, we first have to ask a bigger question. What even is a sacrifice? Why did so many cultures do it? Well, academics have a couple of big ideas on this.
So on one hand, you've got the thinker René Girard. He argued that sacrifice is basically a social safety valve. It's a way for us to channel our own violent tendencies onto a substitute so we don't end up turning on each other. But then, on the other hand, you have Marvin Harris, who comes at it from a much more down-to-earth angle. For him, it's all about a biological need. It's about food. Simple as that.
And for our purposes today, we're going to run with Harris's idea. Because this concept, that a sacrifice is really just a highly ritualized meal, is the key that unlocks this whole puzzle. Yeah, it's about feeding the gods, but it's just as much about feeding the priests and feeding the whole community. It's a sacred dinner party.
So, how do you take something like a hunt and a barbecue and turn it into this profound, sacred act? Well, to get that, you have to kind of step into a different way of seeing the world, a worldview called animism.
See, animism creates this huge problem if you're a fan of, say, steak. If every single animal has a soul, and that soul could come back for revenge if you harm it, well, how do you eat without constantly worrying about a vengeful ghost bison showing up? It's a genuine spiritual problem.
And this isn't just some philosophical thought experiment. For early humans, this was a major practical concern. How do you get the protein you need to survive without racking up a huge spiritual debt that could bring disaster down on your whole tribe?
The solution they came up with is actually pretty brilliant. You bring in a divine middleman. See, the hunter doesn't kill the animal for himself. No, he's killing it for the god. By dedicating the kill, he's basically transferring all the responsibility. Now, if the animal spirit wants revenge, it has to go after the god, who's definitely powerful enough to handle it. And this slick little move lets the whole community eat in peace, totally protected.
But of course, it's never that simple, is it? The whole sacred meal theory works perfectly until you run into these other sacrifices where the humans don't get a single bite. These were offerings that were just completely torched.
Let's look at some Roman rituals. When they made sacrifices to the gods of the underworld, these chthonic or, earthly deities, the entire animal was burned to ashes. No feast, no sharing, nothing for the priests. The offering was completely and utterly destroyed.
And the logic behind this is actually crystal clear when you think about it. There was this hard and fast rule. The world of the living and the world of the dead do not mix. You just can't share a meal with the gods of the underworld. Trying to do that would be crossing a seriously dangerous spiritual line. So the offering had to be given over 100%. The ancient Jews had a similar idea. They called it an olah, which means going up, as in going up in smoke to God. Now, when this term was translated into Greek, it became holocaustos, which literally means all burned. And if that word sounds familiar, it should. This is the direct etymological root of the modern English word holocaust, a word with so much weight, and its history starts right here, with the specific ritual of a total offering.
Okay, so armed with all of that, let's circle back to our original mystery, the red heifer. At first glance, it kind of looks like one of these all-burned offerings, right? But when you really start to look at the details, it doesn't fit anywhere.
Right off the bat, it fails the most basic tests for what a sacrifice is supposed to be in its own tradition. For starters, it wasn't actually offered to God. And then there's the location. The whole thing wasn't done at the main holy site, not in the temple, not even in the tabernacle. It was performed outside the camp, way away from the center of worship. I mean, for a sacred offering, that is a massive red flag.
And from there, it just gets weirder. Get this. This is the only ritual where the victim's excrement, it's dung, is actually included in the burning. Now think about that. In a system that is obsessed with ritual purity, that detail is completely shocking. But here's the biggest clue of all. The entire point of the exercise isn't the act of offering. It's the product it creates. The one and only goal is to end up with a pile of ashes.
And that, right there, is a final reveal. The entire, elaborate, super-specific ritual of the Red Heifer. It wasn't a sacrifice. Not at all. It wasn't an act of worship. It was a chemical process. It was an ancient, ritualized formula for manufacturing a powerful cleaning agent that they used for ritual purification. The ashes were the whole point all along.
So, what we've really done here is we've unpacked a sacred rite, and we've found a recipe for a product hidden inside. And it leaves you with this really fascinating question, doesn't it? What other ancient rituals, filled with all this symbolic meaning, might we be completely misinterpreting? What if some of them aren't just about belief, but are actually a form of forgotten, ancient technology?
All right, today we're diving into one of history's absolute weirdest and most baffling religious rituals. It's a commandment that has stumped some of the wisest people who have ever lived for thousands of years. The strange, mysterious ceremony of the Red Heifer.
Now that quote, that's not from just anybody. Tradition says those are the words of King Solomon, the wisest man in history. So what was the one thing this legendary king, who supposedly understood everything, just couldn't wrap his head around? Yep, the very ritual we're talking about today.
And believe me, Solomon was not alone. The Red Heifer, or para aduma in Hebrew, is pretty much universally considered the most difficult to explain of all the biblical commandments. It's a true ancient enigma, a law that seems to operate on a logic from another planet.
So you have to understand, we're not just looking at some old dusty ritual here. We are digging into what is, for all intents and purposes, an unsolvable riddle, a paradox of faith that people have been debating for millennia without ever finding a real, solid answer. I mean, just think about the sheer brain power that has been thrown at this thing. You've got King Solomon, like we said. You've got the great Jewish sages who, after investigating it from every angle, basically threw up their hands and said, "It eludes me." And even today, modern scholars and theologians are still trying to unpack what it all means.
Okay, so to really get why this is so baffling, we need to walk through the ceremony itself. And the details are incredibly specific, almost bizarrely so. But they are the absolute key to the entire mystery.
It all starts with the animal. And the requirements were just unbelievably strict. It had to be a perfect red cow. And when the law says perfect, it means perfect. Completely red. Though, ancient Jewish law later made a tiny exception, allowing for up to 2 non-red hairs. It had to be without a single blemish or defect. And this is crucial. It could never have been used for labor. It could never have had a yoke placed on its back. This had to be an animal in its absolute purest, most natural state. So what do you do with this perfect animal? Well, the procedure was just as specific. It was taken outside the camp, over to the Mount of Olives, and slaughtered with a priest watching. Its blood was then sprinkled 7 times in the direction of the holy sanctuary. Then the entire animal, and I mean everything, hide, flesh, blood, even the dung, was burned right there on the ground. And into that fire they threw 3 symbolic things: cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet wool. Finally, the ashes from all of this were carefully gathered up and stored away. And right away, this is a huge red flag that something is different here. This is the only sacrifice that was commanded to happen outside the holy sanctuary. Every other offering, every single one, took place inside the sacred area. This one was done on the bare ground of the Mount of Olives, totally separating it from all other rituals. It's a huge signal that we're in a category all its own.
So, what was the point of all this? Those ashes, they were the main ingredient for a special kind of cleansing water. Its one and only purpose was to purify people from the most severe type of ritual impurity there was. And we need to be clear, this is about ritual impurity, not about moral sin. We're not talking about being a bad person. In this ancient worldview, just coming into contact with a dead body put you in a spiritual state that blocked you from the sanctuary. And this water, it was the only antidote.
But here's where the riddle really kicks in. This whole ritual is designed to create something that makes people pure. But in the process of making it, it does the exact opposite to everyone involved. This is the purifying paradox.
Let me break this down, because this is the whole mind-bending mystery right here. The goal of this entire elaborate, super specific ceremony is to produce ashes that can take an impure person and make them clean. But the unbelievable consequence? The very act of making these ashes takes every single pure person who touches them and makes them impure. Seriously, think about this for a second. The priest who oversees the whole thing, he becomes impure. The person who does the physical work of burning the cow, impure.
Even the person who gathers the ashes at the end, who has to be pure to even start the job, they become impure too. How can a process designed for cleansing make everyone who performs it unclean? It makes no sense.
This paradox isn't just some logical quirk, though. It actually taps into a really deep concept. If you look at the Arabic word haram, it has this fascinating double meaning. On one hand, it means sacred, holy, something you can't violate. But on the other hand, it means forbidden, taboo, off limits. It's this idea that the holiest things and the most forbidden things can be two sides of the very same coin. The Red Heifer ritual seems to live in that exact space, a process so intensely sacred that it actually becomes dangerous to handle.
So, to try and make sense of this strange logic, it helps to look for clues elsewhere. Were the ancient Israelites the only ones doing something this specific with red animals? Well, it turns out, no. Their incredibly powerful neighbor, ancient Egypt, had its own version.
And what's really fascinating is that the Egyptian rules for their sacrificial red oxen were, at least according to the Greek historian Herodotus, even stricter than the Israelite ones. While Jewish law eventually said, okay, a couple of non-red hairs are fine, the Egyptians demanded absolute, total perfection. A single black or white hair in the animal was disqualified.
So the similarity is pretty intriguing, right? But the historical record suggests that the Egyptians took the basic principle behind this ritual to a much, much darker and more shocking place.
Yeah, you heard that right. According to the famous anthropologist Sir James Fraser, the Egyptians didn't just stop with red cattle. He reports a tradition where they also sacrificed red-haired men, burning them and scattering their ashes. It's an absolutely brutal parallel, but it suggests there was this shared ancient logic that connected the color red to the most powerful and the most dangerous kinds of sacrifice.
So, after going through the ritual, its paradox, and these really unsettling echoes in other cultures, where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us right back where we started, with a mystery for the ages.
For a lot of theologians, the answer is that there is no answer, at least not one we can understand. The great 11th century commentator Rashi called this commandment a huk, basically a divine decree that exists completely beyond human reason. In this view, it's not meant to be figured out. It's just meant to be obeyed. It's the ultimate test of pure faith.
And this idea that the mystery is intentional, it echoes down through the centuries. One scholar from the 1600s noted a tradition that the ritual's true meaning is sealed, that it's just not meant for us to understand until the end of days with the coming of the prophet Elijah. The answer, it seems, is not for our time.
And so we end with the question that this ancient ritual basically forces us to ask. The paradox of the red heifer, where the thing that purifies also makes you impure, suggests a world where the sacred and the dangerous are one and the same. It leaves us all to wonder, what does it mean if the very things that can make us clean are also, in their raw state, the most dangerous things we could possibly handle?
All right, today we are diving into one of the most intriguing puzzles you'll find in the Quran. We're talking about a story that actually gives its name to the Holy Book's longest and, you could argue, most foundational chapter. I mean, think about it. You've got this massive chapter, 286 verses. It covers everything from law to history to deep theology. So why on earth is it named the cow? It seems, well, a little strange, right, for such a short story to get top billing. So let's get into the story itself and figure out why it's so important. And listen, this isn't just us wondering about this. This puzzle goes way back. I'm talking all the way to the 8th century. You had this Christian theologian, John Damascene, who thought the story was so bizarre that he actually called it out specifically. So you can see right from the get-go, people were looking at this story and thinking, okay, what's going on here? Okay, so to really get a grip on the different interpretations, we've got to start with the story itself. It's basically this conversation, right? A back and forth between the prophet Moses and his people, the Israelites. And it all kicks off with a super direct command from God. Sounds pretty straightforward, doesn't it? Just a simple, direct command. But the response Moses gets? Yeah, it's anything but simple. It's definitely not immediate obedience. So their very first reaction is just total disbelief. They basically look at him and say, are you serious? Are you making a joke at our expense? I mean, wow. Right away, this sets a really confrontational tone for the whole thing. So instead of just, doing what they were told, they start peppering him with questions. They start asking for all these details, making a simple command way more complicated. And the first thing they want to know is, okay, what color is it? And here's where things get really interesting, because this perfectly shows the consequence of all their questions. God gives them an answer, sure, but it's super specific. We're not talking just any yellow. It has to be a bright yellow, one that's beautiful to look at. So just like that, the task gets a whole lot harder. But you guessed it, they don't stop there. So after even more back and forth, they finally get the full picture. Now the cow can't have ever been used for work, no plowing, no watering fields. It has to be in perfect health, and it can't have a single blemish on it. I mean, they've basically questioned their way into finding a needle in a haystack. The requirements have become almost impossible. The whole thing wraps up with this really telling line. It says they finally did it, but it makes a point of saying they almost didn't. You can just feel the reluctance. So what is all this hesitation about? What does it all mean? Well, that's where the interpretations come in. All right, let's get into the first big take on this. We're going to look at a really influential modern commentator, Syed Abul Ala Maududi. And for him, this whole story wasn't just about a command. No, he saw it as something much deeper, a profound test. So here's the core of his argument. Maududi suggests that the Israelites had been living in Egypt, right? And while they were there, they kind of picked up the local habit of cow worship. So when God commands them to slaughter a cow, well, you see where this is going. It's a direct shot at their idolatry. It's a test to see where their true faith lies. Is it with the one God or with this idol? So from Maudi's point of view, all that hesitation, that wasn't just them being confused. It was a symptom of weak faith. He basically saw their questions as a stalling tactic, right? A way to shelve the issue, as he put it, just hoping the whole thing would go away. But here's the beautiful irony. The more they tried to squirm out of it, the more specific God's instructions became, essentially backing them into a corner where they had no choice but to confront and sacrifice the very animal they revered. Okay, now let's switch gears to another major voice, this time a classical commentator named Ibn Kathir. He comes at this from a totally different angle. He's less focused on the whole idolatry thing and much more interested in the attitude behind all those questions. For Ibn Kathir, this story boils down to one word: stubbornness. He argues that if you look at their history, the Israelites had this pattern of challenging their prophets, always asking these nitpicky, unnecessary questions. And for him, the story of the cow is the ultimate example of this. They basically made life difficult for themselves, punishing themselves with their own stubbornness. And this right here is the absolute key to Ibn Kathir's whole take on it. The initial command, it was simple. On purpose. Any cow would have worked. That was the whole point. It was their flat-out refusal to just listen and obey that caused God to keep adding these tougher and tougher conditions. So all that hardship, it was completely 100% self-inflicted. Okay, so let's just recap and put these two views right next to each other. For Maududi, it's a test of faith to root out idolatry. For Ibn Kathir, it's a punishment for their stubbornness. They're different, for sure, but notice the common thread. Both interpretations paint the Israelites' actions in a really negative light. And that brings us to the big question. Why? Why this negative framing? I mean, why would these incredibly influential scholars come up with interpretations that are so critical? Well, the answer really lies in the problem the story itself posed for them. It was a real dilemma. Because according to the sources we're looking at, this story was a genuine headache for the early commentators. It was just weird. So weird, in fact, that its position as the namesake for this huge chapter was seen as kind of embarrassing and difficult to explain. They felt they had to dig deeper and find some kind of profound meaning to make it all make sense. So you see, these interpretations were doing a lot of heavy lifting. First, they give a logical reason for what seems like a pretty bizarre story. Second, they helped explain why God spends so much time in this chapter focusing on Moses and the Israelites. And the answer they landed on? It was because of their flawed character, because they were, as the commentaries describe them, mischievous, idolatrous, and stubborn. That's why they needed all this divine attention. And really, that's the crucial takeaway here. These interpretations of the cow story, they're not really just about a cow. They're actually a theological tool. They're used to build a much larger narrative, one that explains the whole relationship between God and the people of Moses inside the Quran's framework. The story ends up becoming this powerful metaphor, one that defines an entire people by their supposed flaws. So that leaves us with one last thing to chew on. The story of the cow itself is ancient, right? But these interpretations from people like Maududi and Ibn Kathir, they are still incredibly influential today. And that brings up a really important question for all of us. How do these layers upon layers of commentary, built up over hundreds of years, continue to shape not just how people understand a sacred text, but how they see each other and how they understand their own shared history? All right, so today we're going to dive into a single ancient ritual and how it's been understood in two radically different ways over thousands of years. It's really a story about symbols, about belief, and how our own perspectives can completely shape the reality we see. So let's get into it. So this is the central mystery, right? You've got this unbelievably specific ceremony, a perfect red cow, its ashes mixed with water for purification. I mean, it sounds pretty out there, but the meaning behind it? Well, that has fascinated and divided thinkers for centuries. Okay, so let's rewind and start at the very beginning with the ritual itself. If you look in the biblical book of Numbers, the ancient Israelites are given this very, very particular set of instructions for how to become pure again after certain events. And the rules for this thing were super strict. The cow had to be perfectly red, not a single non-red hair on it. It couldn't have any blemish, and it could never have been used for work, meaning it must never have had a yoke on its back. Its ashes were the key ingredient for cleansing a very specific kind of spiritual impurity. But why? What's with all these rules? Well, one really compelling theory says we need to look at the culture the Israelites had just left behind. See, you gotta remember, before the whole Exodus story, the Israelites were in Egypt for centuries, and Egypt had its own incredibly powerful and complex religious world. To really get a handle on the red heifer, we first have to understand what cows, and especially the color red, meant to the ancient Egyptians. And right away, you see this huge clash of symbols. On the one hand, cows were sacred animals. They were linked to the goddess Isis, this revered mother figure. But on the other hand, the color red? Whoa. Red was bad news. It was the color of the god Set, the ultimate villain in Egyptian mythology, who literally murdered his own brother, Osiris. And this wasn't just some minor dislike. This negative vibe around the color red ran deep. We have Greek historians like Diodorus Siculus and Plutarch telling us that Egyptians might have even sacrificed red-haired men because they were associated with the evil god Set. They for sure sacrificed red cattle, which they believed were basically vessels for the souls of wicked people. So for an ancient Egyptian, a red cow would have been an object of absolute contempt. And this brings us to one of the earliest big theories about this whole thing, from a 17th century scholar named John Spencer. He argued that the Israelite ritual wasn't them copying the Egyptians at all, it was the exact opposite. It was a complete rejection of Egyptian beliefs. By sacrificing a red cow, an animal the Egyptians despised, the Israelites were making a powerful statement, symbolically cleaning themselves of all that Egyptian religious influence. It was, in a way, their declaration of theological independence. Okay, now let's hit the fast-forward button. We're jumping forward hundreds and hundreds of years. A new faith, Christianity, is born out of Judaism. And when its early thinkers look back at this exact same strange ritual, they see something completely different. They weren't seeing a rejection of Egypt. They were looking for a preview of their own savior. And to pull this off, they used this incredibly powerful interpretive tool called typology. The basic idea is pretty simple. Key events, people, or rituals in the Old Testament aren't just history. Nope, they're types. Think of them like foreshadowing or previews that find their true meaning and fulfillment in the New Testament, specifically in the life of Jesus Christ. And this wasn't something that happened way later. This rereading of the scriptures started happening very early on. The Epistle to the Hebrews, for instance, draws a direct line from the purifying power of the heifer's ashes to the cleansing power of Christ's blood. The Epistle of Barnabas takes it even a step further, basically saying the heifer is Jesus. The ancient ritual was being completely recoded with new symbols. Which brings us to probably the most detailed and, honestly, one of the most influential examples of this symbolic decoding, coming from one of the absolute giants of Christian thought. So you have St. Augustine of Hippo, and he lays out this incredibly detailed one-to-one map connecting the ritual to Christian beliefs. For Augustine, nothing was random. The red color, that's not about some Egyptian god anymore. No, that points to Christ's suffering, his cruel passion. The fact the cow was unyoked, that symbolized Christ's freedom from sin. The ashes became a metaphor for the gospel being preached and spreading across the world. And the water for sprinkling? Well, that was the sacrament of baptism. Okay, let's just pause for a second. We have the exact same ritual being seen in two completely opposite ways. One says it's about rejecting Egyptian paganism. The other says it's a prophecy about Christ. How is that even possible? Well, modern cognitive science actually gives us a pretty useful way to think about this. It's a cognitive bias known as Maslow's hammer, and the idea is actually really simple but also pretty profound. You know the saying, if the only tool you have is a hammer, it's tempting to treat everything as if it were a nail? Basically, the framework you use to understand the world totally shapes what you're even able to see. So for those early Christian thinkers, what was their hammer? It was typology. This core idea that everything in the Old Testament was secretly pointing toward Jesus. And with typology as their hammer, every single part of the red heifer ritual became a nail. So first up, Jesus is the heifer. But he's also the priest who's performing the sacrifice, and he's the ashes that result from it. And he's the one doing the sprinkling for purification. And get this, he's even the one being sprinkled and purified. Every single piece of the puzzle, every element, became a nail that just had to be hit by that hammer of typology. It all had to point back to the central truth of their faith. And that's really what this whole story leaves us with. The red heifer isn't just some dusty piece of ancient history. It's an incredible case study in how belief systems actually work. And it kind of forces you to ask yourself, what are my hammers? What are the tools and assumptions I use to make sense of my own world? And what nails are they creating all around me, maybe without me even realizing it? When you dig into ancient scriptures, some rituals, they make a certain kind of sense. And then there's the red heifer. It's a ceremony that's described as being absolutely critical for cleansing the ultimate impurity, which is death itself. The only problem? It seems like almost every single step of the ritual breaks the very rules it's supposed to be part of. So what are we really looking at here? Is this some sacred divine law handed down from on high? Or could it be something else, something older? Maybe the echo of an ancient ghost story, just hiding in plain sight inside the holy texts. Okay, let's dive right in. To even start to get our heads around this mystery, we first have to look at the ritual itself. And it is really, really strange. So the whole process is, well, it's bizarre. It starts with a perfect, completely red cow, one that's never even been yoked. Then it's sacrificed outside the holy camp, which right there is a major red flag. The whole thing is burned down to ash, and those ashes are mixed with water to purify people who've touched a dead body. I mean, from start to finish, just about every step is a giant exception to the normal rules. Now, all of these strange rules led one theologian, a guy named H.S. Smith, to come up with a bombshell theory way back in 1909. He argued that this ritual isn't what we think it is. He claimed it's a relic, a pre-biblical, pagan sacrifice that was really designed to appease the spirits of the dead, and that, over time, it got absorbed and disguised within Mosaic law. And that's the theory that's going to guide our entire investigation. So, to even begin to unpack that claim, we have to kind of zoom out. We need to understand the ancient world's profound relationship with death. See, it wasn't just seen as a loss. It was seen as a source of powerful spiritual contamination. The word we really need to focus on here is taboo. A corpse wasn't just, unclean in a hygienic way. It was considered spiritually radioactive. The idea was that the spirit of the dead person kind of lingered, and if you touched the body, you could get infected with this supernatural contamination. And here's the thing, this fear was absolutely universal. If you look all across the ancient world, you see the exact same pattern. From Greece to Africa to India, basically every culture had specific purification rituals for anyone who got too close to a corpse. So this wasn't just a Hebrew idea, it was a deeply, fundamentally human one. And this is where the logic gets, well, it's fascinatingly backwards. The more powerful or sacred a person was in life, the more contaminating their corpse was believed to be after death. And why? Because their spirit was thought to be that much more powerful and therefore more dangerous. The body of a high priest wasn't just a body, it was a spiritual biohazard. Okay, so with all that in our back pocket, let's put on our detective hats. Let's follow the clues hidden inside the red heifer ritual itself. All right, clue number 1 is the most obvious one, but it is packed with meaning. Of all the colors in the world, why did this animal have to be perfectly, flawlessly red? Well, red is the color of blood, the universal symbol for life itself, right? And that powerful symbolism made it a super important color in funeral rites all over the ancient world. We find red coffins, red banners at funerals, red objects buried with the dead. It's like the color itself was a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the spirits. Now let's look at clue number 2, how they treated the blood. In pretty much every other major Hebrew sacrifice, the blood is sacred. It belongs to God. It's carefully collected and presented on the holy altar. But with the red heifer, most of it is just spilled on the ground. This is a radical difference, and it really suggests the offering wasn't for the God above, but for something or someone in the earth below. And here, this might be the smoking gun. Clue number 3, the location. Holy sacrifices happen in holy places, period. But the red heifer ceremony took place before the sanctuary, which tradition tells us was on the Mount of Olives, a well-known, ancient cemetery for Jerusalem. And the final clue is the fire. The heifer wasn't burned on a sacred altar. It was burned completely on the ground itself. This kind of total consumption, this Holocaust, is incredibly similar to pagan rituals that were meant to appease or honor the spirits of the underworld. So, when you start to put all these clues together, the color, the blood, the location, the burning, a very, very specific picture starts to come into focus. I mean, that choice of location, it couldn't have been an accident. According to this theory, the ritual was done in a cemetery, precisely because that's where the spirits were. You go to where the problem is. And what's amazing is that later Jewish tradition seems to confirm this exact issue. Get this, the Talmud talks about this incredibly elaborate arched bridge that was built from the temple to the Mount of Olives for one specific reason, to make sure the priest wouldn't accidentally become impure by walking over a hidden grave. They literally knew they were conducting this holy ritual in a spiritual minefield. So the verdict here, according to this theory, is that the red heifer was originally a pagan rite, a practice that was so old and so deeply ingrained in the culture that it couldn't be outlawed. So instead, it was absorbed, given a new theological paint job, and slipped right into the law, a clever disguise for an ancient ritual for the dead. But the analysis doesn't just stop in the ancient past. The author actually uses this whole interpretation to issue pretty stark warning about modern movements that want to revive this very sacrifice. And that warning comes in this incredibly provocative statement. He says that people who want to bring back the red heifer ritual are just like the most infamous idolaters in the Bible, the worshippers of the golden calf. Wow. So why would he make such a harsh comparison? Well, the author points to 3 connections. First, the obvious one, a calf and a heifer, both cattle. Second, the color. He argues the Hebrew word for red could also mean a golden, tawny color, linking it to the golden calf. And third, geography, suggesting both of these cow-centric rituals have roots that trace all the way back to ancient Egypt. And that leaves us with one final, powerful question. If this ancient, mysterious ritual were actually brought back today, would it be the restoration of a holy law that was forgotten? Or would it be the repetition of a very, very old and very pagan mistake? And that's the unsettling thought at the very heart of the red heifer mystery.